aircraft that were clearing talks about
Greetings and welcome to Conflict Radio. All right, hey everybody, greetings and welcome to Conflict Radio. Today is November 4th, 2021. Let's give a shout out here to everybody who's hanging out with us. I know it's a little early in the show. We got Dr. Strangelove in the house, Hank Stolk, Sapphire Sun, Not Quite Human, Will Carr, AB, Hugh Godarn, Incognito. Let's see, Arlene Adkins-Zell is here, Off-World Adam. Welcome to the show, Off-World. I seen you in Discord earlier today. I was real busy. I didn't get a chance to comment on anything. Chuck Bam is here, the Happy Plague Doctor. Antonio is in the house. Welcome, Antonio, to the show. Blue Chicken, I see, and I guess that's as far back as it's letting me go. How is everybody doing today? Now, we're gonna be doing. I guess the picture is a little deceiving. I was just looking for. I was looking for witches, and I just thought it was such a cool pic. I was like, you know what? I'm just gonna go with this one here because I like cats. So that's the pick today, I guess. Our guest today is Peter Muise. Now, he's an author with degrees in anthropology from Bates College at Brandeis University, Brandeis University, has been exploring New England legends, folklore, and weird traditions for 20 years. He's been blogging at New England Folklore since 2008, and he is the author of Legends and Lore of the North Shore. His recent book has also appeared in Sam Baltrusis' 13 Most Haunted Crime Scenes Beyond Boston. Peter has appeared as a guest expert on the Travel Channel's Mysteries at the Museum. Peter, welcome to Conflict Radio. How is your day going today?
It's going great. How is your day going?
You know, it's all right. I had to, it's getting cold out, and last night was the first night I've had to bring my plants in, and I have, I guess, two cats, I guess, here that weren't here last winter. Well, one was, but one just, we were able to put the plants up where he couldn't get them because he was so tiny. So I have two cats here that are new to this whole plants in the house thing. And I've had to add lemon to the water squirt bottle and everything, and it has been a war with the cats and my plants.
You know, the cats are going to win. You just know that, right? The cats always win.
Well, you know, I've been Googling these things and trying to figure out what to do. So I put like a lemon juice in the water bottle, and you squirt it all over the plant. So if they eat the leaves, it kind of tastes like crap. So. I seem to be winning right now. I'd lost this morning when I woke up, and one of them was knocked over, and I keep them like on top of the fish tank there, and spilt dirt all over inside the fish tank. So it's definitely been a battle here the last 24 hours with these plants in the house. Let's get into the topic, I guess. Folklore in New England. What a mysterious. It's just a whole thing of mystery up there, isn't it? Can you tell us a little bit about the legends that are going on up around the North Shore?
Sure. I was born in Massachusetts. I've lived here most of my life, except for a brief stint where I went to college in Maine. And, when I grew up, I was one of those kids who always liked, mythology, like Norse mythology, Greek mythology, things like that. And I grew up as a kid in the 70s. And in the 70s, there was also a lot of paranormal topics started to really become popular in the media. So, Bigfoot, UFOs, the Bermuda Triangle, which was really, really big in the 70s. Not so much now, but back in the 70s, it was really big. And plus, I had an older brother who was into a lot of that stuff as well. So I kind of had two streams going in my brain. I had like the folklore mythology stuff, like, Greek mythology, Roman mythology, things like that. Then I also had kind of this paranormal stuff coming at me from the media and from my older brother and things like that. And so I was always interested in those topics. And it was really only when I was older, like when I was in my 20s, that I realized I didn't really know much about sort of the mythology and folklore of New England, which was the place I lived my whole life. And so I just started to delve into it and do some reading and do some research. And that was, at least 20 years ago. And I have never stopped since. It's just always been more for me to find out and more for me to read about. And it's like a bottomless pit of weird and interesting stories. And I just put out another book on September 1st, Witches and Warlocks of Massachusetts, which is just witchcraft stories, even because there are so many witchcraft stories from this area.
All right. I mean, we all know about the Salem witch trials, right? Is that pretty much what you're referring to?
I talked about the Salem witch trials, but there were witch trials before the Salem trials. Then after the Salem trials ended, there were 300 additional years of witchcraft stories and witchcraft legends. So, the Puritans came over from England let's say, they started in 1620, they came to Plymouth, and it's like Salem's founded in 1626, Boston's founded 1630, and the other towns on the coast are founded around that time too, like 1640s and things like that. And, by 1641, the Puritans had enacted a law against witchcraft, making witchcraft a crime punishable by death. And then the first person executed in Massachusetts was executed in 1648. There was a woman named Margaret Jones who lived in Charlestown, Massachusetts. And so this is almost 50 years before the Salem witch trials even happened. So in New England, there were 83 court cases involving witchcraft before the Salem trials even happened. And of those 83 trials, there were 11 people who were executed, and 5 of those people lived in Massachusetts in particular. So it was 5 women who were executed before the Salem witch trials in Massachusetts as witches. So there was quite a bit happening before the Salem trials even occurred.
So including before the witch trials and after the witch trials, how many people were put to death in New England for supposedly being a witch?
It would have been, I'm doing the math in my head. It was 30 people were executed as witches. And then one man was, during the Salem witch trials, one man was killed while being tortured. So technically he was not executed, but some people count him as being executed. He was, there was a man named Giles Corey. Some people know this story. He was a farmer. He was 81 years old. He was a farmer in Salem, and he was accused of being a witch. When he was brought into the courtroom, he refused to speak. So he just refused to say anything. When they questioned him, he didn't say a single word. And according to Massachusetts law at that time, if someone refused to speak during a trial, the court could cover their body with heavy stones to try to make them speak. And so the officers of the court and the sheriff took this 81-year-old farmer, this man named Giles Corey. They took him out of the courtroom and tied him to stakes pounded into the ground in a field. They put some boards on his chest, and then they started to pile these heavy stones on top of him in order to try to make him speak. So they're basically torturing him to try to get him to speak. And so they put all these stones on him, and the sheriff says, Giles Corey, do you have anything to say? And he doesn't say anything. They put more stones on top of his body. They say, Giles Corey, do you have anything to say? He doesn't say anything. They put even more stones on. They say, Giles Corey, do you have anything to say? And Giles Corey says, more weight. And so that's all he said. He just said, more weight. So they put more stones on top of him, and then his chest cavity is crushed, and he dies from that. And so so technically he was not executed, but he died during torture. So if you include him, there were 31 people killed as witches in New England, including the Salem witch trials.
That's really not that many. I was expecting you to say like a couple hundred. Well, I mean, I understand that, but for some reason, like in my mind, I'm thinking there were hundreds and hundreds of people that were killed during this thing. I mean, I guess that's not too bad, right?
During the Salem trials, there were about 150 people accused of being witches. And they would have executed more of them, except the trials were ended. So there were lots of people in jail waiting execution, but the people realized the trials were a big farce, and they shut them down. So a lot of people who would have been executed were not executed. So still, I don't know, 31, like how many people have been executed as witches
Yeah.
this year,
Yeah,
none,
lately,
which is great, right? So
No, I mean, I guess it is a lot. I mean, so how did they actually prove to people that they were witches? I mean, how would you prove something
yeah,
like that?
it's a lot of sort of synchronicity almost they would look at and things like that. So let's say we'll do a hypothetical example. Let's say I accuse you of being a witch, right? It's 1692. You and I are living in Salem, Massachusetts, and I'm like, oh, Michael's a witch, right? And usually a witchcraft accusation starts off when two neighbors or two people who know each other have an argument. So I'll say like, oh, Michael came to my house and he was like, said, oh, can I have a dozen eggs? I'm hungry. I need a dozen eggs. And I was like, Michael, I don't have enough eggs to spare. I can't give you any. And you walk away and you're muttering under your breath, like, rah, 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 right? I'm like, ooh, that's not good. Then the next day, like, one of my chickens dies mysteriously. And then the day after that, like, none of my chickens lay eggs. And then the day after that, let's say my child gets sick and no one can explain why my child is sick. And then maybe, my cow gives milk, but the milk is somehow spoiled as it comes out of the cow's udders already. And I'm like, oh, I think I'm being bewitched. And who is possibly bewitching me but Michael, right? Because we had that argument.
Yeah, yeah.
And Michael's a surly guy, right? He fights with people in Salem, so therefore he's probably a witch. And so proving it is really hard, though. And so, they would take sort of circumstantial evidence, like let's say, the milk from my cow is acting weird, like I can't churn it into butter or whatever you're doing with your milk. So I think the milk from the cow would be bewitched. I'd throw the milk onto the fire, right? And the next day I would see Michael walking around in Salem and he has a strange burn on his face and he won't tell me where the burn came from. I'm like, oh, I see the connection. I threw the bewitched milk into the fire and then Michael is burned because he was the one who bewitched my milk. So that type of evidence, people might make that connection.
Wow, that kind of stuff wouldn't hold up in the court of law today.
No, it shouldn't, right?
Yeah, were they tried with juries?
They were. Yeah, it was a pretty elaborate process.
I mean, it was kind of like the normal trials we see today, right?
Yeah.
Wow,
yeah,
that's crazy.
And there was even often an additional step where like there might be like a grand jury that would hear the case to see it was worth even moving on to a jury that would actually try the case. So it was not just this like haphazard thing, but it's important to know that like in the 1600s in Massachusetts, there were no professional lawyers. Like no one was a professional lawyer. So there was sort of these magistrates or these judges that were appointed. None of them had been to law school. None of them had really studied law. They were like often ministers or wealthy people who just happened to get appointed to these positions because they were well connected politically. So it wasn't like they were the sharpest minds in the legal world. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And they're being tried and also if you think of the 1600s, a lot of like these Puritans came over really early. Some of the first settlers in Massachusetts, like they could have seen Shakespeare's plays performed live on stage for the very first time. Like that's how long we're talking about. So this is like the Renaissance, basically the late Renaissance. So it's a really different worldview, much more steeped in magic, witchcraft, and the occult than the centuries after that. So people just firmly believed in witches. And the Puritans, when they came to Massachusetts, they really thought they were setting up like God's kingdom on earth. That was kind of their mission, right? They wanted to set up like a God's kingdom on earth. But then the corollary of that is that they thought that the devil was trying to, tear down God's kingdom on earth. So they were always on the lookout for the devil's attempts to overturn Massachusetts or other New England colonies. And, there would be attacks by the Native Americans who would come down from the north and burn settlements and things like that because they didn't want their land taken. But the Puritans see that, the devil is somehow instigating the Native Americans to attack our settlements. Not just thinking, well, this is just a political thing, right?
Yeah.
Because we're stealing their land. They would think, no, it's because the devil is making this happen. So they would look to see where the devil was acting out around them. So they always had that in mind, I think.
So let me ask you this: with all the research you've done on this, is there any cases you've come across where you think that maybe that person was actually a witch?
And I want to be really careful too. I want to clarify how I'm using the word witch, because it has a lot of different meanings. And so there are people today who, say they're witches, like they practice witchcraft as a spiritual path, right? They may be Wiccan or some other form of witchcraft like that. So, they use crystals and they honor the elements and they honor the seasons and they honor pagan deities. That's not what the Puritans were talking about when they were talking about witches. And that's not what I really talked about in my book. I'm using like the older term for witch.
You're talking about like stirring stuff up in a cauldron, right? Like,
I'm talking about like someone who's using magic to hurt you.
Yeah.
Someone who causes harm through magical means. And I don't think there were any witches then. I really don't. They were just people who were on the wrong side of a political dispute, or they were people who were unpopular. You look in the Salem trials and some of the other trials, often it was women who, weren't following the gender norms for the society at the time. So maybe they were too outspoken or too argumentative. And so people accused them of being a witch, or they might have been too sexually promiscuous, so people accuse them of being a witch, things like that. Or sometimes people just maybe wanted their land, so they would accuse you of being a witch. So the different things that came into play. I will also say, though, that I don't think, and no one who was executed or accused of being a witch was really a witch. But lots of people did use magic at that time. Like magic was a common thing, similar to how people use magic now. So the people would say, like if you were a sea captain, you're trying to figure out when to set sail on your voyage to like the Caribbean or something, you might go to an astrologer, and the astrologer would draw up a chart and say, oh yeah, Michael, your ship should set sail on June 3rd because the weather's going to be good because I can see where the stars are in this chart. That's a good day for you. Younger people would do simple forms of magic to figure out who they were going to marry. They would use this technique called the Venus glass, where you take a glass of water and then you crack an egg and put the egg white into the water, and you look at the shape, you sort of interpret the shape that the egg white makes, and that shape of the egg white tells you like what your future spouse will be. So if it forms the shape of like a ship, that means like, oh, you're going to marry a sailor. Or it forms the shape of a plow, like, oh, you're going to marry a farmer, things like that. And there's a case, a reverend in Massachusetts in the 1600s talks about some young girls who are playing with this Venus glass, like, oh, he, we want to figure out who we're going to marry. So one of them, breaks the egg white into the glass and is looking at the egg white to try to interpret it. And it forms the shape of a coffin. And this really freaks her out because it means she's going to die before she gets married. And she does indeed die like the next year before she gets married. So you get these sort of stories of people using magic. But I wouldn't say they were witches. Like people use magic now all the time too, right? You read your horoscope online, you maybe draw a tarot card to see how your day is going to go, things like that. And one of the main ways people would use magic was to defend against witches, because people were afraid of witches. And so a lot of the magic you see is actually sort of defensive magic or counter magic to protect your house or yourself against a witch. And even still today, you see people who, put up a horseshoe over the door, right? And people's like, it's just a kooky superstition. It's just meant to bring luck to the house or something. But in the 1600s and even up into the 19th century, it was very specifically done to keep witches out of the house. Like you put up that horseshoe to keep out a witch. That's what the point of that was.
Really? That's what it. I didn't even know that. I thought that was a good luck thing. I didn't know that it had to do with.
That's witches. What people view it now as a good luck thing, because we don't really believe in witches.
So let me ask you this: as far as like the evil witches go, the whole thing with the hat and the broom and the stirring things up in a big pot and all that stuff. Does that actually exist? Or is that just an idea, like a story? Is that just kind of like a myth? I think it's just like an idea or an archetype, right? It's like this concept people created of what
they thought was sort of the opposite of all the good things in society. And I can speak mostly about like Massachusetts and New England. So if you look at like the Massachusetts idea of what a witch was, right? The witch is somebody who signs their name in the devil's book in return for material wealth or power over people that they hate. And then they use their magical powers to cause trouble for their neighbors secretly. And so things like, this idea of like you're signing your name in the devil's book, and you would use your own, supposedly people would do it in their own blood, right? They sign their name in the devil's book. But that's like a parody or like the exact opposite of that people who would join the Puritan church would sign their name in a book. But in this case, like you're not signing your name in like the church's book, you're signing your name in the devil's book because it's the evil one, right? And instead of focusing on like spiritual things or trying to get to heaven, you're really focused on material things. You focus on money, you're focused on getting nice clothes, you want a new horse, things like that. And so it's just the opposite of what people thought a good person should do. And a good person should help their neighbor, but witches are bad people, so they're not helping the neighbors. They're, harming the neighbors or killing the neighbors, supposedly, right? That's the myth.
Yeah.
What will happen.
Could you tell us your most interesting witch story, I guess, from those times?
There are so many of them.
You got to have a favorite, though, right?
I'll tell you, this is the one I've been telling everybody. It is my favorite. It's from the 1700s, so it's after the Salem witch trials ended. And I will just say, like, the Salem witch trials ended because people realized that it was a legal farce. They realized that basically people came to the realization that you cannot prove the existence of witchcraft in court, or you can't prove the existence of the devil in court either. So they realized you couldn't prove it in court, but it didn't mean they stopped believing in witches. They still believed in witches. And so you get these stories that come, 100 years, 200 years later of people still believing in witches, like this one I'm going to tell right now.
All right.
So there is a sea captain from Cape Cod. His name is Sylvanus Rich. So his name is Sylvanus Rich, and he's a sea captain. He lives on Cape Cod. He goes to South Carolina with his ship, and he gets a cargo full of grain, and he needs to bring that grain up to Boston. So he's sailing up the coast, and then he's sailing along the Cape Cod coast that faces the Atlantic. And he's sailing along past a town called Truro, Massachusetts, which is very, it's way out there on the Cape. It's kind of isolated, and it has these huge, huge sandy dunes that slope down to the ocean. The dunes are like 100 feet high. They're just giant dunes. So Sylvanus Rich and his crew is sailing up along these dunes, and he sees, nestled among the dunes, this tiny hut with smoke coming out of the chimney. And he says to his crew, like, we've been sailing for so long, we've only had like brackish water and beer to drink for the last several weeks. I'm going to row over to that hut and see if they have some milk, because I want to drink some milk. I'm tired of just beer and water. So he gets in the rowboat and he rows to this little hut on the shore all by himself. And the crew sees him go there. Then they see him go into the hut. Finally, he gets back out of the hut, gets in the boat, and comes back to the main ship. And he says to his crew members who are waiting for him on the deck, he says, "The woman inside that hut was the ugliest hag I have ever seen in my life. But this milk that she gave me is the sweetest milk I've ever tasted." And he has this big bucket of creamy white milk with him. And he tells his crew, "So I'm going to go down to my cabin and I'm going to drink this milk." So he goes down below decks and goes in his cabin. And he closes the door. And as soon as he closes the door, a huge storm arises out of nowhere and just spins the ship around and shreds the sails. And the ship is just sent adrift out into the Atlantic Ocean with the sails totally ruined. And the crew members like pound on his door. They're like, "Captain Sylvanus Rich, Captain Rich, help us. Tell us what to do. The sails are shredded to pieces." They don't hear anything from inside his cabin. The next morning, he comes up on deck, and he's really haggard looking, like his eyes are bloodshot. He's got big bags under his eyes. He has a really strange, almost incomprehensible expression on his face. And he says to the crewmen, he says, "Last night, the hag who gave me that milk appeared in my cabin, and she rode me like a stallion all night up and down the length of Cape Cod. And here's the proof. And he lifts up his shirt, and the crewmen can see that he has bruises all over his body in the shape of a woman's shoe, as if a woman has dug her heels into his sides while she rode him like a horse. And he says, and the hag will come for me again tonight, so I must once again go into my cabin and prepare. And he goes in his cabin and closes the door. And the crew is like, they can't tell, is he like scared of this hag, or is he excited to see the hag? It's kind of ambivalent to them what's happening. And so this goes on for several days, where the ship is adrift, the sails are ruined, and Captain Rich is just spending all his time in his cabin, and every night this hag, this witch, comes and rides him like a horse up and down the length of Cape Cod. And so finally, the crew is thinking mutinous thoughts, right? Like this captain is useless. We have to get rid of him and save ourselves. When suddenly another ship appears on the horizon. And luckily, it is captained by Sylvanus Rich's son. And so Sylvanus Rich's son comes over to his father's ship. And the crew says, your father is bewitched. This hag has been riding him every night like a horse. And so his son goes down below decks into the cabin and somehow breaks the spell. Like, the story does not explain how the son breaks the spell. Like, they just slap it out of his father. I don't know. But somehow he breaks the spell, and his father comes up, Sylvanus Rich comes up on the deck and says, all right, let's repair these sails. We have to get this grain to Boston. So, they fix the sails with the help from the people on the other ship, and they sail to Boston with this cargo of grain from South Carolina. And when they pull into the harbor, the merchant, who has been waiting for this grain for like a long time, is there on the wharf. And he's like, Captain Sylvanus Rich, why is this cargo so late? I've been waiting for a week. And Sylvanus Rich says, just blame it on the sweet, sweet milk of Satan. And that's the end of the story.
Do we have any idea what her name was?
We don't, but Sylvanus Rich is a real person. I've seen his grave in Truro, Massachusetts. He died in, I think, 1735 or something like that. So there was a real person somehow, and this story kind of grew up around him. He died when he was relatively young, and he had a son, but his son was only like 11 or 12 when Sylvanus Rich died. So I don't think his son was captaining, a ship out in the Atlantic at that time. But there's also another story from Truro, very similar, where a sailor steals donuts from a witch. Like the sailor's walking to his ship in Truro, and he sees this hut. There's always a hut, and he can smell this delicious smell coming from the hut. And he goes inside, and there's like this platter of freshly fried donuts and a small black goat sitting by the fireplace, but there's no human inside. And so the sailor's like, oh, I'm just going to steal these donuts because no one's going to catch me. And I would, of course, be suspicious about a small black goat, but I guess the sailor wasn't that suspicious. And he steals the donuts, and a very similar thing happens to him. Like, again, a witch appears and rides him like a horse every night as punishment. But in that case, he actually supposedly kills the witch because he shoots her with a silver button that he gets from his jacket and loads it into a pistol and shoots her. And because it's a silver item, it's able to kill her, even though she's just appearing in a spirit form, not in a physical form.
Oh, all right. That's like a werewolf thing there.
Yeah, exactly. I think this silver works. It's one of those things against all kind of supernatural entities. Yeah.
All right. Well, I have a feeling that her name was probably Betty. Throw that out there.
Right? There's a famous Betty from Maine, actually. I don't know if you know this one, Betty Booker. Again, it's another witch. I think she's from Portsmouth or New Hampshire, maybe Portsmouth, New Hampshire, or Portland, Maine. I can't remember exactly where. But again, like, she rides a sea captain like a horse. And it was sort of a traditional witchcraft thing you see in New England, is that was something a witch would do. They would appear in your bedroom at night. They sort of materialize, right? It's not a physical thing. It's like they're sending out their spirit to come into your bedroom, and they have with them a bridle, like a horse bridle, and they throw it over your head. And once that's over your head, you are forced to act like a horse, and they ride you all over the place. And I mean, the sexual connotations are pretty blunt there, I think, right? It's like this woman shows up, she puts a bridle on, and she rides like a horse. And it's always women. I haven't seen any cases where a man does it. It's always a woman riding a man. So I think you've got this kind of, we're talking about like what is a witch. You can see, like, in this case, like in this time, at this time in society, women were supposed to be submissive to men, but these witches are not submissive to men. They're making the men submissive to them. And so they're kind of the opposite of what should be happening.
Yeah, I guess they would be like the 16th century. What's that word I'm looking for? Oh,
Like a dominatrix.
yeah, I suppose. All right. Well, let's move on from that for a little bit, because I do want to talk about sea serpents and stuff.
Sea serpents, yeah.
We did notice, you and I were talking about it, a question earlier on about the sea serpents and the water dragons, right?
Yeah, I think that was in your chat.
Yeah,
right?
it was all the way at the beginning, but like probably 10 minutes before the show even started. But what could you tell us about the sea serpents in New England? I mean, were they around? Are they still around? What's going on up there with that?
I will say, I'm going to say I don't know if sea serpents are real. I can tell you the stories about sea serpents that I know. So I'll put it that way. Like, I've never seen a sea serpent, but there have been stories about sea serpents since the 1600s. And one of the earliest ones comes from this writer named John Jocelyn, who came to Maine and Massachusetts in the early 1600s. He was from England, and he just came to New England to like tour around, and he wrote a couple books about it. And so while he was visiting Maine, he hung out with some settlers up there, some colonists, and they all told him spooky stories. They were telling him like ghost stories and things like that. And one of these men told him that he had been in a canoe going across Casco Bay in Maine, and he was in the canoe with a couple of Native Americans from the area. And as they're canoeing across Casco Bay, they're passing by this large rocky outcropping, like a small island made of rock. And on this small rocky island is a gigantic sea serpent. And it's like very large and very thick. I don't know how long it is, but he doesn't really say, probably like 20 feet long or something like this. And so the English colonist picks up his musket. He's like, I'm going to kill that sea serpent. The Native Americans are like, don't do it. Like, that bullet's just going to bounce off it, and then it's going to be really mad at us. And so he just puts down the musket, and they just cruise on by, and they just leave the sea serpent alone, because there's no way they're going to be able to kill it. They're just going to annoy it. So that's sort of the earliest one. That's from the early 1600s. And sea serpents were seen like in Lynn, Massachusetts, I know, also in the 1700s as well, on the shore of Lynn, Massachusetts. Kind of long animals, like about as big around as a barrel. So big. That's a big animal if it's as big as around as a barrel. The most famous one, sea serpent, appeared in Gloucester, Massachusetts in the early 1800s, like in 1817. And Gloucester is a pretty big town, particularly in the early 1800s. It was like a pretty decent sized seaport and fishing town. And so in 1817, this sea serpent appeared in Gloucester Harbor. And again, it was like, people said it was about as big as around as a barrel. So that's as wide as his body is. People said it was maybe between 70 and 90 feet long. So that's a big animal, if it was true, right? If it's true, it's a big animal. And they said it kind of moved like a caterpillar through the water, kind of like, scrunching up, stretching out, scrunching up, stretching out, scrunching up, stretching out, if you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That kind of caterpillar movement. And some people said it had a head like a horse. And some people said it had a head like a serpent, which would make sense, I guess, since it's a sea serpent. And a couple other people said it even had a horn on its head. And so lots and lots of people saw it. All different types of people, like sailors, fishermen, people on shore, wealthy women, just random people walking on the harbor, people using telescopes. All sorts of people saw something in the water in Gloucester Harbor. And somebody, again, tried to shoot it, didn't hurt it. The animal didn't seem to care. And it was basically this giant animal, people were saying, that was relatively harmless. And at one point, another one showed up, and they saw two of them, and they just sort of were like frolicking around in Gloucester Harbor together in 1817. And there's an interesting little anecdote here where a group of naturalists, kind of like a group of scientists in Boston, were starting a museum. They were called the Linnean Society, and they were starting a museum in Boston, and they heard about the sea serpent up in Gloucester. Like, it would be great for us to get that sea serpent and put it in our museum. And so somebody walking along the beach in Gloucester found this long black snake. It was only like maybe 3 feet long, so it wasn't a huge snake. And it had big bumps on its back. And they thought, oh my God, we have found a dead baby sea serpent. This is a dead baby sea serpent we found here on the shore. And so some of the scientists from Boston, from this group, the Linnean Society, went up to Gloucester, and they got this 3-foot snake with the bumps on it and said, oh, we have found a baby sea serpent, and we're going to put it in our museum. So they brought it back to Boston. They put it in the museum. They're super excited about it. But then a couple biologists from Harvard came to the museum and like, you idiots. This is just a standard black snake that has like a fungus growing on it. Like, this is not a sea serpent. This is just a standard black snake that is sick and grew these weird bumps because it's sick and died. And so, the people who put it in the museum were embarrassed and like took it out of the museum. But people still saw the giant sea serpent after that as well. So the giant sea serpent showed up for years and years. I think the last time it was seen in Gloucester was like 1960. So it was seen for a good long time. So that's sort of the most famous.
So when they're talking about sea serpents, they're talking about some kind of giant snake or something? It's not...
A giant snake-like thing, yeah.
Is it... I mean, obviously the images of the Loch Ness Monster come to mind. Is it that sort of thing, or...
I think that's what it would have looked like.
Yeah.
That's what people thought it looked like. It was very snake-like. It didn't have, like, legs. I don't think it had fins. It was just sort of like a giant snake-like thing, like a giant eel or like a serpent, like a giant snake.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So the Loch Ness Monster, I mean, that's kind of, I mean, they've thought of that as being kind of a dinosaur, I suppose, right? A dinosaur that escaped extinction, even possibly. I mean, it's possible that those things were all over the world. I mean, there's stories of them being in the Great Lakes even. Right.
I mean, people have seen sea serpents and lake monsters all over the place. It's hard to say. Like, there's supposedly one in Lake Champlain in Vermont. There's supposedly some sort of lake monster up there. No, I guess I'm a little skeptical sometimes of these stories, and it's easy for me to be skeptical when I'm like in my house or during the daytime. I'm like, oh, there are no monsters. But then if you put me like out in the ocean in the middle of the night, I probably would like believe in sea serpents in like 2 seconds, pretty much, So the same with the woods. Like, I'm a little skeptical about Bigfoot stories, but then if you put me in the woods at night, I'm like, oh yeah, I hear a noise. It must be Bigfoot. Let's get out of here. So.
Yeah, that's definitely true. What are some of the most haunted sites up around the New England, Boston area?
There are a lot of them. I guess I'm trying to think of my favorite ones I've been to. I guess there are a couple. I'll tell you like 2 of the creepiest ones I've been to. There's one in Rhode Island called the Ramtail Mill, and it's in Foster, Rhode Island, which is west of Providence, so it's sort of out in the country part of Rhode Island. And this was a mill, like a manufacturing mill that was built in the 1700s. It was built up along the side of this small river, so the river kind of powered the mill. I think they made cloth or something like that there. And the mill was built by this wealthy man, and a small village developed around the mill. So everything's going along just great. And one day the manager of the mill goes to the owner of the mill and says, I've been managing your mill for a while. I'm doing a great job, and I would like to marry your daughter because I'm a good person and your daughter's very beautiful and I'm falling in love with her. And the owner of the mill kind of laughs and is like, no, you're not going to marry my daughter. Like, I'm a rich person. You're just one of my employees. There's no way my daughter will ever be allowed to marry you. And so the manager of the mill kind of rushes off, and he's, really upset. The next morning, everybody in the village wakes up because they hear the bell ringing that's, summoning them to the mill to go to work. It's morning time. They hear the bell ringing, time to go to work. So everybody goes into the mill, and they're horrified to see that hanging from the rope on the bell is the manager. He's hanged himself with the bell rope. And that's why the bell is ringing, because his body is swaying back and forth and ringing the bell. And so all the workers are really freaked out. The owner just cuts down the body. He's like, this guy was crazy. Don't pay any attention to this. Just go back to work. And so people go back to work. Next morning, the bell rings again. Everyone gets up from their beds and they go into the mill to go to work. And they can see that the bell rope is ringing, like the bell is ringing, but there's nobody pulling the rope. The rope is just moving all on its own. And everyone's like, oh, this seems a little weird, doesn't it? And the owner of the mill is like, oh, I think it just must be a strange wind or something. So he removes the rope entirely from the bell. Next morning, you can probably see where this is going. The bell rings again. Everyone goes into the mill to go to work. And they can see that the bell is ringing completely on its own. There's no rope attached to it at all. The bell's just moving completely on its own and ringing. And all the workers like, oh crap, this place is haunted. Like that guy killed himself and now this mill is haunted. And so after that, people began to see the manager at night walking around in the mill carrying a lantern, even though, he's dead. But they see his ghost walking through the building at night with a lantern, kind of doing his rounds and inspecting things. And they realize, this place is really, really haunted. And so people refuse to work there. And so slowly people leave the village, the mill shuts down, and it becomes abandoned. So if you go to the Ram's Hill Mill area now, there's the ruins of the mill, and there's the ruins of the abandoned village that you can see. And so there's a road, there were stone walls, there were foundations, and some of the foundations are really big, like big structures were there, and it's just all gone. Like there's nothing there now. You're just in the middle of this abandoned, haunted ghost town. And it's a spooky place. I will say when we went, there were just the two of us there, wandering around in these woods with, nobody around us, looking through a haunted village. And I took a lot of photos with my iPhone. And the weird thing was a lot of them didn't come out. Like that has never happened to me before. It only happened to me in one other place. So I took some photos with my phone and they just came out pure white. Like on my phone, they were just pure white. And I was like, this is really kind of freaky.
Yeah.
And it was really unsettling to me that we were in this super quiet place, spooky legend attached to it, ruined buildings, and I'm taking photos and they're not coming out. And so that was when
is the bell still there?
The bell is not there. I don't know, did someone melt it down for scrap metal or whatever, but the bell is not there. Just the ruins of the town is there, and the mill. So, but it's a creepy place worth visiting.
Yeah, that sounds pretty cool, actually. That sounds really neat. So let me ask you this. It says here, I'm reading my little memo here. It says that you know about Melonheads.
Oh yeah.
What's a Melonhead?
Yeah, Melonhead's it's a monster that's really only found in Connecticut and parts of maybe in the upper Midwest, like Ohio and a few other places like that. It's only found in two parts of the United States. And so it's found in some rural areas of Connecticut. And a melonhead is like a little humanoid with kind of like a little spindly body. And they have a large, oversized head. And they often have these glowing orange eyes. And they kind of supposedly, this is the myth, whether it's true or not, they supposedly lurk in the woods in certain, quiet country roads. They eat they'll eat cats, they'll eat dogs, they'll eat, small animals. And supposedly they may also eat hikers who get lost or hitchhikers or, people who wander into the woods and don't come back. That may be, blamed on the Melonheads. And there's a great story about Melonheads. It's from the 1980s where these 4 high school girls who live in a town in Connecticut are like, oh, we want to go see the Melonheads. So we hear all these legends about Melonheads. Let's drive out down the country roads and try to find one. So they go down a certain road in their town that has a reputation of being a melonhead road, and there were a few of them in the area. So they get in their they get in a big sedan, the 1980s style sedan, and they drive down this wooded road, and then they park the car. And they shut the car off, and they all get out of the car. And maybe they have flashlights, right? And they're walking around on the road, like shining lights in the woods, saying, "Here, melonheads, here, melonheads," right? They really want to see some melonheads. So they're walking away from the car, looking for melonheads, and suddenly the car headlights come on behind them, and the girls are freaked out, and they turn around, and they can see inside the car, in the driver's seat, is this little tiny humanoid with this giant, oversized head and big orange eyes, and it's gripping the steering wheel. And the melonhead like turns on the car and like steps on the gas, and the big sedan like comes down the road towards these high school girls. And girls like jump out of the way into the woods, and the car just like goes off into the darkness, right? And it's gone. And people say supposedly, and I don't know if this is true, people say supposedly that this car is still sometimes seen driving around rural Connecticut late at night, and it's filled with like melonheads, like it's a whole car full of melonheads out there driving around in the darkness. So keep your eyes out for a big 1980 sedan if you're out in the rural parts of Connecticut, and let me know if you see it, I guess. So,
yeah, we were just looking at I just scrolled through some of the pictures of those things on if you search Melonhead of Connecticut, some really creepy pictures come up. It's
yeah,
kind of
there are a couple different stories about where they supposedly came from. And one of them ties back to what we were talking about earlier with witches, that there was, there's in the 1600s in Connecticut, there's a small town or a small settlement, and a family in that town is suspected of being witches, right? Their neighbors say, "Oh, those people are witches." And so rather than execute them or imprison them, they exile the family. The family is kicked out of the settlement, and they're sent off to live in the woods. And so the family survives, but they just, barely. So they're kind of like eating wild animals and eating bark or whatever, but they survive. And then they, they interbreed with each other, right? They commit incest. And so the family kind of interbreeds and devolves slowly from being fully human to being these sort of melonhead creatures through incest and this living out in the woods. So that's one origin story of the Melonheads, that they are kind of this Puritan family that was kicked out of the settlement and devolved over time into being these Melonhead creatures.
yeah.
The other, there was an insane asylum which was shut down, which happened quite often, right? There are a lot of abandoned insane asylums around. And some of the patients were just sort of had nowhere to go. They're just thrown out into the woods. And so that the Melonheads are perhaps some of the patients from this asylum. And again, like I'm a little skeptical if there are Melonheads, but again, like if I were out in the woods in Connecticut at night, maybe I would be more willing to believe, I guess,
Yeah. Man, there's some definitely some creepy stuff going on up there. What's the creepiest experience you've had personally? Did you ever encounter anything strange? Did you maybe think that you did?
I guess I have a couple. Like that story about the Ramtail Mill was a little creepy to me.
Yeah.
I don't know if this counts, but I remember when I was a little kid, I must have been like 4 or 5. I must have been 5 or 6, right? I was pretty small. I was hanging around in the backyard with my brother and our neighbor, another kid, this kid named Wayne. We're hanging around the backyard at night. It's probably the summertime or whatever. And we saw this big, bright, glowing object come down in the sky and went down behind a hill near us. And we were so freaked out. We all thought it was a UFO. We ran in the house. We were terrified. We were like telling my parents, "Oh my God, we saw a UFO," right? We saw this big object, glowing object or whatever in the sky. And like our neighbor would not go home until his parents came back from church. And so it was a big deal to us. And like, I don't know, as an adult looking back, like, was that really a UFO that we saw? Maybe, maybe not. but I kind of remember the feeling that I had, and this kind of fear, this sense of fear, like I was really scared, but also this sense of amazement too, that we had finally seen like this incredible sort of paranormal thing in the sky. So like I remember that vividly as a kid. Since then, nothing quite of that caliber. We've gone to some creepy places, I think. I'm not a ghost hunter. I don't go out with like
yeah, you're not like all
looking for ghosts or things like that. But we do go to various places and poke around and things.
But you don't bring all this equipment and stuff with you.
Right.
Yeah.
And we went a few years ago to a place called the Freetown State Forest. And this is down in southeastern Massachusetts. It's a big park, basically. And there was a lot of weird stories about the Freetown State Forest. And I'll recommend a book, which I did not write, but it's by Christopher Balzano, and it's called Dark Woods. And it's just about the Freetown State Forest and legends there. And he interviewed people who live all around the Freetown State Forest to get their stories about like ghosts. There have been a series of murders there, monsters, all of this stuff. So we went to the Freetown State Forest just to like poke around, and like we parked our car at the parking area, and all the trees there were dead because maybe a pine borer beetle or something, I don't know, but so all the trees are dead. We're walking down the path surrounded by these dead trees, and in the distance we can hear gunfire because I guess there's like a shooting range or something nearby. So like to start right off, it's just not a calming experience. You're walking through a dead forest and hearing a lot of gunfire. It's not like, oh, this is a welcoming place, Yeah. We're walking through the woods, and it was like early March, so the leaves weren't out yet. The trees were kind of blowing in the wind, and so many of them were squeaking. Like they would rub against each other, and you just hear like, and we're walking through the woods. I'm like, okay, like, this is not like a relaxing place. I can see why there are a lot of creepy stories here. And so we walked for maybe like 45 minutes, and we didn't see anybody. And the landscape even there was a little strange. Like there are a lot of paths, but they're sunken really deep into the ground for some reason. So you're almost like in a little trough, which is odd to me. They're like sunken like maybe 2 feet into the ground. I don't know why that is. But so we were walking around in these weird little troughs. The trees are squeaking. And finally we see people up ahead of us. And it's like this group of 4 or 5 teenagers who are all like totally messed up. I don't know what they were on, but they were like drugged out of their mind. Like, okay, this is not.
They were on shrooms.
Maybe I was just like, this is not this is not a fun Bambi forest experience we're having here. This is like the creepy forest experience. And so we were going there particularly to go to this place called the Assonet Ledge, which is a ledge overlooking a small pond. And people have seen ghosts there and things like that, but in particular, there were stories about creatures called pukwudgies. I don't know if you know what a pukwudgie is.
No.
It's like a small, hairy, magical being, kind of like it's like a indigenous dwarf, perhaps, or an indigenous fairy. But they're kind of like they're maybe 3 feet high and covered in long hair. Some people say they have noses like dogs, or they have these kind of long faces. And there are some stories where they're kind of malevolent. And so like people say that the Assonet Ledge is a place where these pukwudgies have been seen, and they've been known to like push people off of the ledge, right? A lot of people have supposedly died on this ledge, and people say that the pukwudgies do it, that they will appear and they'll push you off the ledge and you'll die. When you fall off the ledge, you kind of bump your head as you fall into the water and stuff like that. And so for some reason, like, oh, well, let's go to this ledge. Like, let's go see this place where these little hairy monsters kill people. Whatever. At least it was daylight. And so we're walking through these creepy woods that are squeaky, dead, and full of drugged out teens, heading to this ledge where supposedly pukwudgies push people off to their death. And so we're walking and just getting creeped out, basically. And we finally reach the Assonet Ledge, and like all the creepiness dissipates because there's like there's a group of school children on top of the ledge having a picnic with like, you know, their activities director, and people are laughing and playing around, and suddenly all the creepiness disappears. But up until that point, like I could definitely see why people say the Freetown State Forest is a creepy place, because it was a creepy environment to be in, you know.
Well, I mean, you did mention fairies, and that's another thing that they have up in the Northeast around the North Shore, right? Fairies?
Yes, definitely. I mean, there's fairy folklore from all the New England states. And like I was talking earlier about the Pukwudgies, I think that's kind of the modern form that people believe the local fairies are in. And, you know, like we were talking earlier about the Puritans. When the Puritans came over in the 1600s, they came from a part of England called East Anglia, which had a lot of witchcraft belief, like really strong belief in witches in East Anglia. And so that's why, one of the reasons why there were a lot of witchcraft trials in New England, because the people brought those witchcraft beliefs with them. East Anglia did not have a lot of fairy beliefs. Like some parts of England, Scotland, Ireland have really strong fairy beliefs. East Anglia didn't have a lot of fairy beliefs at all. And so when the Puritans came over here, it's like, oh, there are no fairies here. Nah, there are no fairies in New England. There's nothing here. But they were ignoring basically the Native Americans who, you know, said there were lots of like magical creatures who lived in the woods or under the hills or in the ponds or in the rivers and things like that. And so there's lots of different names for these. The Native Americans had lots of different names for these beings, but they had some similar traits. Like they were often kind of morally ambiguous, right? You wanted to treat them with respect, but they could, if they weren't treated properly, they would become malevolent, and you know, they might blind you, or they might cause you to get lost in the woods and freeze to death, or things like that. But if you treated them with respect, they would leave you alone, or maybe even help you out. And you know, maybe some of them were particularly good and some of them were particularly bad, but overall they were kind of like these morally ambivalent beings, right? And often they were described as being very small with lots of long hair.
Yeah, we had somebody on the show, I guess it was a few months ago, did a show on fairies, and it was surprising how evil that they are, right?
Right. I am hesitant to use the word evil, I guess, but I would say,
or mischievous.
You know, like
I guess,
you watch
right?
Disney movies, you watch like Peter Pan and Tinkerbell's like flying around in a tutu with wings, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, children see fairies as kind of these cute little winged creatures, which is, you know, one way to see them. But that's not always how they've been seen traditionally. And often they've been seen as sort of like kind of these magical, powerful, but kind of ambiguous beings that share the world with us. And you need to treat them well, or otherwise they will not treat you well, right? And you know, like often, like in Ireland or someplace like that, they might call them the good neighbors. Is like a euphemism for a fairy, like, oh, the good neighbors, because you want to treat your neighbors well, so therefore they will treat you well, I think. And so the names that people have used have changed over time for what they will call these beings. And so a lot of people now in New England use the word Pukwudgie, which is, you know, actually comes from the Ojibwa people who live in a Native American group in the upper Midwest, but somehow it ended up being used in New England as well. So people will talk about Pukwudgies here in New England quite a bit. And I've heard, you know, different things like, you know, people who live around the Freetown State Forest have seen them and often say that they were stalked by them, right? Like people, like a woman said she was walking her dog, I think this was in the 1990s, walking her dog in the Freetown State Forest, when she saw this small person who was about 3 feet tall and covered in hair, like sitting on a stump, watching her and her dog in the woods. And the woman and the dog were, you know, justifiably freaked out. And so they turned around and got the heck out of there. But then the woman who had been walking the dog said she saw the same creature like outside her house at night. And that it would like look at her from the woods, or sometimes look in the window at her and things like that. And it only ended when she moved. And there's another very similar story from a man in the area who supposedly saw a pukwudgie in the woods. And then he would see it like, by the side of the road at night, or he'd go out at night and turn on his car to go drive someplace. When he turned on the headlights, there in the headlights, he would see the pukwudgie looking at him. And so again, he moved away, and that's how they, if you want to call it the haunting or whatever it is, that's how it ended. And so, if you believe these stories, they're kind of creepy. I've also had somebody, though.
I do believe in the Fae. I do. I think that there's some real. There's something real there, definitely in the stories of the Fae. I do. Yeah.
They certainly recur a lot, right?
Now,
and
Goatmen, on the other
very
hand,
similar.
Goatmen, on the other hand, I have a hard time believing, but that's a thing in the Northeast too, isn't it?
It is. Like there are Goatmen stories all over the U.S. Lots of Goatman stories, and I found a few from this part of the country. My favorite one is from Cherryfield, Maine. I've only seen it in one book, and I wrote to the author, and where did you get this Goatman story? Because it's so good. And she never got back to me, so I perhaps will never know where she got the Goatman story. But it's from this town called Cherryfield, Maine, which is a small town in Maine. And the story is pretty simple, and it goes like this. A man is driving his pickup truck down a road through the woods in Cherryfield, Maine. So he's driving down the road in his pickup truck. He's listening to the radio, just driving down the road. And suddenly the radio in his car shuts off, and then the engine in his car shuts off. It's like the car has just completely died. Everything is dead. And so he's kind of puzzled. So the man gets out of his car, and he lifts up, the hood, and he's looking at the engine, and he can't see that anything's wrong. So he doesn't understand why suddenly his car is not the truck is not working at all. And as he's looking under the hood, he notices a man emerging from the trees, and the man walks across the road. And so the guy who's driving the truck looks closely at this man, and, from the waist up, he's wearing a red flannel shirt, and he has a beard. But then from the waist down, he has goat legs and is naked, and he also has two small horns. And so he's like a goat man, but he's wearing a red flannel shirt. And so the goat man looks at the man who was driving the truck, and he just smiles at him, gives him like a brief, creepy smile, and then keeps walking and disappears into the trees. And as soon as the goat man disappears into the trees, the guy's truck engine comes back on, the radio comes back on, and the guy gets back in the truck and he just drives the hell out of there and tells people that he had just seen a goat man in the woods. And I like that story because of it's creepy. Like if I saw a goat man in the woods, I would be creeped out. But also this, how the truck shuts down. Like that's kind of a classic like UFO story thing that you see in UFO stories, that electrical systems are disrupted when something unusual happens. So normally it would be a UFO, but in this case, it's a goat man. And I also like that he's wearing a red flannel shirt, because that's very Maine, right? It's cold in Maine. You're not going to run around shirtless, even if you are half goat. Like it's too cold. You need to wear a shirt up there.
It's like a Paul Bunyan thing.
It is, right? So I kind of like that idea. The other goat man story I know comes from Cape Cod, and it's supposedly from the 1970s. Again, if these stories are true at all, I don't know. But I like stories, so I like these stories. It's like in the 1970s, and a teenage boy is home alone, and it's December. I think it's like 1978. So let's say December 1978, this teenage boy is home alone. His parents have gone out to do some errands. And this teenage boy is sitting in the living room watching TV. And right above the TV is a window that looks out into the backyard. So this teenage boy is watching TV, and at one point he looks up from the TV and looks out the window, and as he's looking out the window, he sees this hairy face is looking in the window at him. And the teenage boy screams, and whatever's looking in the window screams as well, and it runs off. And the teenage boy is, freaked out and scared by this. So he calls all his friends, and he says, "Did you guys pull a prank on me? Did one of you put on like a gorilla mask and come over here and scare me?" And all his friends were like, no, we didn't. We're all at home, because you can tell, because you're calling us on the phone like we are at our parents' homes. And so the teenage boy says, get over here. We have to figure out what's happening. So the teenage boy's friends come over, and they get up their courage to go out and look in the backyard. And when they look in the backyard, they think they're going to see like big footprints, but instead they just see the footprints of cloven hooves. And they see the cloven hoof prints lead off into the woods and disappear in the snow. And that's the end of that story. But
that's creepy stuff.
It's creepy, right? You think you're going to see one thing, but instead it's cloven hooves. And
did they have horseshoes on? I
know. I don't know, right? I don't think they did. I think they just had a little unshorn
like little goat hoofs.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can definitely tell the difference between a horse and a goat.
Right, they have those little split. They have the split in the front. Yeah,
that's crazy. Yeah, I was thinking of something else there, made me laugh. All right, guys. So if anybody has any questions for Peter Muise, go ahead and put it in the description box, and we'll get to those questions. Vash here has a question. He says some people who have had interactions with Bigfoot claim that he shape-shifted into an alien. Could there be a connection between all of these various creatures and aliens?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I guess I will say, like I've said before, I'm kind of a skeptical person. I like these stories though. And I've read stories that go back thousands of years, right? From ancient Greece, Rome, the Middle Ages, the Puritans, the 1970s, 1990s. There are all these stories about people encountering strange beings, whether they're fairies, demons, goatmen, pukwudgies, Bigfoot, aliens, whatever. There are all these different strange things people encounter. And often they act in similar ways, whatever it is that people encounter. So like I was talking about things looking in your window, whether it's a pukwudgie, but then there were stories about witches looking in windows, or Bigfoot looking in windows, or aliens looking in windows, or whatever it is, or things appearing in your bedroom at night. Maybe it's a witch. Maybe people might say it's a demon, right? Maybe it's sleep paralysis. An alien abduction, obviously, right? People say they appear in your bedroom. So I think here's what I say, like, people will always have weird experiences. Like, people are always going to experience strange things. They'll see strange things. They'll feel strange things. And I think what changes is how we explain that strange thing over time. I don't know what the strange things are, but I know people keep experiencing them, and people experience them in different forms and explain them in different ways. So you're talking about, like, does Bigfoot shapeshift into an alien? Probably, because I think if people are experiencing this strange phenomena, which over time has appeared to people in many different ways. And whether it's just like a psychological thing that people are experiencing, it's something buried deep inside our brains that comes out, and we just interpret it based on our culture, or whether it's something else, I don't really know. But I will just say, like, people experience strange things throughout history. Like 10,000 years from now, if people are still around, they'll still be experiencing strange things. They'll probably just interpret it in a totally different way than we are now, but it'll be very similar also.
Yeah, there's actually a few people in the chat here asking about owls. What's the connection with owls? And Incognito says, has Peter looked into the owl man? Part owl, upper body, and part human-looking lower body. That's creepy. I'd never even heard of such a thing.
That's creepy. Owls, right? You hear a lot of like alien abduction stories involving owls, right? Where someone will have a dream about an owl, or they'll see an owl, and then it's almost like, I dreamt about an owl, and then I woke up and I had a weird scar on my body, or I had some missing time or something like that. And I think the idea is that often in these stories, again, whether you believe them or not, that the aliens mask themselves in the form of an owl because they have the similar eyes. They have those giant eyes. And so it's these kind of giant eyes of the owl are really the giant eyes of, like, the entity that has appeared in your bedroom at night to abduct you or something like that. So an owl, I mean, there are certainly people see a lot of flying things, right? You see something in the water, you see something in the woods, but you see, like, the Mothman obviously is the most famous flying cryptid, but people around here have seen a lot of giant birds, like down in a place called the Bridgewater Triangle, which is supposedly an area of Massachusetts where there's a lot of paranormal activity. So people see like giant birds, or they see like, a humanoid with wings that flies straight up into the air without even having to flap its wings, or things like that. So you get sort of those stories.
Do you think that there's actually things out there that we haven't discovered and don't know about, or do you think that perhaps they're just coming over from a different dimension or through a portal or something?
That's a hard question. I will say, like, people see Bigfoot in Massachusetts, right? People see Bigfoot in Rhode Island. People see Bigfoot in Connecticut. These are pretty small states, and people have lived here for thousands of years. Like the Native Americans lived here for thousands of years.
They're full of people, yeah.
And then when the Puritans came, they like cut all the trees down. They just cut those forests down. Like, they burned the wood, they sold the wood, they made ships, whatever. They cut all the forests down. And, now the forests have grown all back up. But it's not like this is some pristine wilderness where a giant humanoid ape could live undetected. You know what I mean? For 400 years. So, did they migrate here? I don't know. I tend to go with more of a psychological or spiritual explanation of some of these things, rather than a physical explanation. Like, it could be something, like I said, that is inside our own minds, or it could just be some sort of spiritual experience. I think if we were a different culture and someone came and said, "Oh, I saw a large hairy humanoid in the woods," like, people here now, like, "Oh, it's a giant ape. We have to go hunt it and kill it, right? We have to capture it." But if this were, the Middle Ages or ancient Greece, people might say, "Oh, it's it's the spirit of the forest. Like, it's a woodland spirit that's out there. That's what we're seeing. It's not an ape. It's a woodland spirit. We should let's leave out a plate of food for it and try to befriend it," or something like that. So I really think our cultures determine how we experience things like this and how we explain them.
All right. So Sapphire Elf says he doesn't really have a question, but what are your thoughts on this? He says there's a universal story of people with boring lives discovering portals to magical places of wonder. They undergo a trial, then return to the real world, and the portal moves on to the next person who needs it.
I don't know. Like, I don't know the story myself. I mean, I feel like that's when I hear that, I think of like fictional things, like the Chronicles of Narnia, where there's a portal to another world, right? Or even Alice in Wonderland, which is a little more psychedelic and less pleasant, perhaps, than the Chronicles of Narnia or something like that. So I don't know. I have not heard that myself. I don't, like, from the things I've read and studied up here, I don't hear a lot about portals. It's more about the legends and the folklore tend to be more about things coming into our world, into our society, right? Or into like our civilized space. Like, it's an incursion from the outside into our world a little bit more, maybe.
Yeah. Let's see here. David Metzger wants to know, do you think shadow people are from a parallel universe? Obviously, you know about shadow people, right?
Yeah, shadow people, like, do not answer the door at night. Like, when the shadow people come and ring the doorbell, right? Those dark-eyed children or anything like that. Again, I think I would answer that one. Like, I am a little skeptical of everything, but like, if you saw a shadow person, what would my reaction be? I would definitely be freaked out, obviously. But I can't really say, like, because all the categories blur to me a little bit. It's like,
it all runs together, doesn't it?
It all runs together. Like a shadow being, a dark-eyed child, I don't know, a malevolent Bigfoot, an alien that appears in your bedroom at night, like Zozo, the Ouija demon, like all these things kind of blur to me, and we get like one like wave of strange stuff that we have to try to understand and try to pick apart in our own minds and make sense of. So, I mean, if people think the other dimension makes sense to them, I say more power to them. I guess I tend to be a little more psychologically or spiritually focused in my explanations, I guess.
All right, Antonio, your question, I don't quite understand it. Maybe try to rephrase it a little bit and ask it again if you could. That'd be great. Vash Wolfward says, does the guest have any good octopus stories?
Oh, I don't. I wish I did, right? Because I love an octopus. I think of Cthulhu, obviously, like the giant octopus-headed being. I don't, like you look at old maps of people of the ocean that include like New England and North America from the Renaissance and later, and often there is like that giant octopus pulling down a ship. But I don't think anybody ever actually encountered one. They did encounter sea serpents, and there were a couple of cases where people encountered like mermen. And again, there was like a story from Maine, this is going back to John Jocelyn and his stories from the early 1600s, where this man named Mr. Mitten, Mitten or Mittin, I'm not sure, Mr. Mitten, was in a canoe in Casco Bay, canoeing around, and he's paddling in his canoe, and suddenly this hand comes up out of the water and grabs the side of his canoe, and then another hand comes up and grabs the canoe, and this triton, he calls it a triton, emerges from the water. And a triton is basically another word for a merman, right? So, and tritons are in legend particularly aggressive, right? They are kind of like angry, strong, powerful merman type creatures. So this triton appears and has grabbed Mr. Mitten's canoe. So Mr. Mitten grabs his axe and chops off the triton's hand, one of the hands. And the triton like lets out a howl and sinks below the waves. And it goes below the waves and the water turns purple with its blood. That's what the story is. The water turns purple with its blood. And the triton is not seen again. So I don't have an octopus story, but I have a merman story. So maybe that's hopefully almost as good.
All right. So what about mermaids up in New England? Any sightings up there? Like,
there's that one with Mr. Mitten chopping the hand off the mermaid. There was I think it was Nantucket in the early parts of the 20th century. So Nantucket's an island just, south off the Massachusetts coast. And there was an isolated lighthouse on one point there. And somebody said that they had seen what looked like a merman or a mermaid swimming around on the beach off this lighthouse. And people thought, that's crazy. There's no such thing as mermen or mermaids. This is like the early 20th century. We don't believe in mermaids. But then somebody else saw this path. Like, it looked as if something had come out of the water and crawled through the underbrush. They saw this big trail through the underbrush that had beaten down as if something large had been dragged from the water into the woods. And it was almost like a nest. They found like a nest, supposedly, in the woods, where this whatever had come from the water had made a nest. They didn't actually see what was in the nest. So whether it was just an animal or was it really a mermaid or a merman, I don't know. But that one that's from Nantucket, that story.
Oh,
so
that's pretty cool.
It's pretty cool, a little creepy. I don't think of mermaids or mermen as building nests in the woods, but I guess they do, according to this story. So
yeah, I wouldn't imagine that's something that they do anymore. Maybe they used to, but they don't anymore. All right. So our Mac wants to know, do you have any stories from Lake Superior? I'm from Duluth, living on the edge of this lake.
I don't. That's outside of my range, but I'm sure there must be a lot of stories from the Great Lakes. I'm sure there are plenty of ghost stories about sunken ships, ghost ships. There must be lake monsters in the Great Lakes, wouldn't there be? Like, they're so big. Someone must talk about Great lake monsters.
Yeah, it's interesting stuff. It definitely is. All right, so Antonio says the Bridgewater Triangle in USA is also a Bridgewater Triangle in the UK. Bridgewater in Somerset County, lots of UFO activities. Is it just a name coincidence? Bridgewater, UK is very ancient.
That's interesting. I didn't know there was also a Bridgewater Triangle in the UK. I'll have to look into that. I mean, the Bridgewater Triangle in Massachusetts, that was coined by Loren Coleman. So Loren Coleman is like the famous cryptozoologist, and he had been studying and collecting stories about cryptids and things like that. And he noticed that a huge number of cryptid and paranormal stories from Massachusetts came from this one sort of triangular area in Massachusetts near Bridgewater. And so he coined the term the Bridgewater Triangle, and it has stuck ever since then. And there's a really large swamp down there called the Hockomock Swamp, which means something like the place of the spirits. So right there, you can tell, like, okay, there's probably something going on in this area. And so the Bridgewater Triangle in Massachusetts, there's just been a lot of Bigfoot sightings, giant snakes, giant black panthers, UFOs, pukwudgies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So just a lot of strange activities that happen there.
Yeah,
I've had friends from that area who, have seen UFOs or have been told by their parents that they shouldn't go picking blueberries out there in the woods or the swamp by themselves or things like that. So I'm not sure. I'll have to look more into the one in the UK. But, a lot of the names in Massachusetts just come directly from England because it was settled by people from England. So they just brought the names with them. So that's where the name would have come from.
All right. Okay. Antonio says exactly the same in UK Bridgewater.
Okay. Yeah.
All right.
I'll definitely look that up. That's really interesting.
Vash Wolfwood wants to know any good stories from Australia?
Australia is totally outside my area of expertise, sadly.
Yeah, that's not really our topic tonight, I guess. We're kind of talking about cryptids of the Northeast, really. And any that we've missed?
Oh, boy. We've talked about most of my favorites, I think, I think those are the good ones.
Some creepy ones out there, that's for sure. You've got, I guess you're not far from the Jersey Devil. You ever look into that at all?
No, but I'd like to go down to the Pine Barrens someday and see all that and see. I don't know if I want to see the Jersey Devil, but I would like to see the area where the Jersey Devil is from.
I've been there. I've been to the ruins of the old house and everything else. I didn't get any bad feelings or anything like that. So I think if the Jersey Devil did exist, I think it was it was probably a deformed relative of the family that just kind of threw it outside. I think that's I think that happens. A Sapphire Elf wants to know if you've ever heard of Bat Squatch, and I can say I haven't.
I haven't. I've heard of Sheep Squatch. I've heard of Sheep Squatch. I think so. That was like a Sasquatch that had sheep horns, which is pretty amazing. But Bat Squatch, is it a winged Sasquatch? That would be amazing.
Yeah, that'd be fun.
And I would really like to see that if that's true. Like, I want to see Bat Squatch.
You want to see Bat Squatch?
I would want to see Bat Squatch. That would be the cryptid that I would like to see the most, right? Who wouldn't want to see that?
I don't even want to see a bat. All right. I'm Spooky says, what about vampires in Connecticut? Connecticut is known for having a lot of vampires, right?
Yes. And the vampire stuff in New England is really interesting because it's pretty well documented. There is a folklorist, he's the Rhode Island folklorist named Michael Bell, and he wrote a book called Food for the Dead. And, he's got like a PhD in folklore. He was the state folklorist of Rhode Island. And he noticed that there were these accounts, these stories, historical stories from Rhode Island of people who said that their dead relatives were feeding on them from beyond the grave. And the situation almost always was the same. It's like a member of a family dies, usually from tuberculosis. It's almost always from tuberculosis, which was very common in the 1700s and 1800s, tuberculosis. So someone in the family dies from tuberculosis and the family buries them. And then other members of the family start to waste away, probably from tuberculosis also. But they believe that they're being fed on by their relative who died before them. And so when they unearth, they will say, we have to do something like, Aunt Susie, who died and is buried, is feeding on us from beyond the grave. So when they dig up Aunt Susie's body, they may find that, she's still fresh looking, or that, her hair, it looks good. Like, it doesn't look like she has decayed at all. And so what they need to do, and this is really gruesome, is that they will burn parts of Aunt Susie's body, whether it's her heart or her lungs or something like that, and then they would consume those ashes. So the people who were alive and thought that Aunt Susie was feeding on them vampirically from the grave would eat the ashes in the hope that it would stop this sort of energy vampirism that was happening. So it wasn't like vampirism where someone would come and suck your blood, but it's where they believe that a dead person in the grave is basically sucking the life force out of you, like feeding on your life force and killing you. And so it was well documented. Like, there are newspaper stories of families unearthing a relative and burning some of their internal organs and consuming them. And sometimes like large crowds would gather to see this happen. And so this is like fact. This is what people believe, and this is what people did. And it was just mostly tuberculosis, which was the cause. And once tuberculosis was had better treatments, this belief in vampires went away.
Huh. Well, that's interesting. Sapphire Elf says, are there any American stories, I guess Northeastern stories, of people missing time after having an encounter with fairies?
That's interesting. I don't, off the top of my head, know. Not that I remember, but there probably could be. And there's a group called the Fairy Investigation Society, which I'm a member of. It's a good organization. And if you look them up on Facebook, they often will have modern fairy stories of people encountering fairies in the modern world. And so, again, I'll put up the Fairy Investigation Society. They may have some stories like that. I will say, one of the first missing time stories I've ever heard that may or may not involve a UFO comes from Boston, Massachusetts. It's from the 1600s, maybe like the 1640s or 1650s. And a couple of men are in a rowboat on this river called the Muddy River, which is a small river near here. So they're on the Muddy River in their rowboat, and they see a light in the sky. And the light at first appears like a glowing orb, and then like it changes shape to look like an arrow, and then it changes shape again to look like a giant pig. And the men are like, wow, this is really weird, this giant light floating above in the sky, above this river. And so after the light disappears, the men realize that they are further up the river than they thought they should have been, and they've gone against the tide. So for them to have gone there, they should have been rowing really hard for like an hour. But somehow they just have ended up 2 miles from where they had been and can't remember how they got there. And so that's like one of the earliest missing time stories I know. And that's from, I believe, the diary of Governor John Winthrop, who was like the first governor of Massachusetts. So someone really thought that story was worth writing down at the time. So people often say that is one of the first UFO stories also. I don't know if it's true, but that's one of the earlier ones I've come across.
All right. Dr. Strangelove says, talking about fairies, is it true they like coins and have real jobs like regular people?
That I have no clue. So here in New England, people talk about pukwudgies mostly. I think, traditionally for a pukwudgie or for a spirit of that type, people would leave out food That would be generally be the offering I think people would leave out. I have heard, and this only appears in one or two places, in Connecticut, people talked about these sort of fairy-like beings called the Old Men of the Mountains. And these were sort of these small hooded people who lived in caves in the Connecticut hills. I can't remember which town in particular. And it was believed that like they might just appear in somebody's home. And again, there's some missing time stories here. Like people say, oh, I saw these small hooded men appear inside my home and it was 12 noon and they were only there for like 2 minutes. And the next thing I knew it was like 5 p.m. and these hooded people had disappeared. But often they said they left behind like these triangular coins after they had appeared in someone's home. So that I've only seen that in like one newspaper from Connecticut. Some reporter in Connecticut had collected several stories about this from local people. So that's sort of interesting there, I think.
Yeah, that's interesting about the triangle coin. I guess if I ever find one, I should hang on to it.
Yeah, or leave it behind. I don't know if it's a good luck or bad luck, right?
Oh, I'm definitely going to have to find out, I guess, because it's coming with me. Right? If I got to put it back, I'll put it back, but it's definitely coming with me. All right. Well, I guess that's going to wrap it up, guys. That's a show for Thursday. Peter, why don't you tell everybody where to find you?
Sure. You can find me at newenglandfolklore.blogspot.com, or if you just look up a New England Folklore blog, I'm pretty much the only one. So New England Folklore blog or newenglandfolklore.blogspot.com. You can also find my new book, Witches and Warlocks of Massachusetts, pretty much wherever you buy books online. So Amazon, Books A Million, Barnes and Noble, bookshop.org, wherever you like to buy books. So that is where you can find me these days.
Awesome. And as always, guys, the link is down in the description box below. Definitely go check out Peter's site. It's really some interesting stuff, and he's done a lot of research and work on this. So definitely check it out. Peter, hang on for a second, and I'll wrap things up and chat with you a little bit when I'm done here. And just want to let everybody know you can find us at www.conflictradio.net. You can always check us out on YouTube for the live stream. If you're listening to the podcast, you can ask your questions on YouTube. That's where we stream live. And you can find us on Spreaker, Apple iTunes, and all of your normal podcast catchers. Be sure to check out the store. Thanks so much, Vash and Jersey Dolphins, for the super chats today. I got your names wrote down here so I didn't forget. Thanks so much for that. Really do appreciate it. The show really does appreciate your support, and we need it. So support's always welcome. Well, I guess that's going to do it for us. I'll be back on Monday, everybody. Have a great weekend. Oh, wait. I forgot. Peter, you still there, right?
I'm still here, yeah.
I almost forgot the question we ask every single guest we have. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Do you know who Corn Pop is?
I don't know who Corn Pop is. Sorry.
Okay, all right. That's totally fine. All right, guys. That's going to do it for us. Batten down the hatches and stay safe.
See aircraft that were clear.